It impacts all our daily lives. So what's going on with the global economy? Hi everyone, I'm Sean Caleb sitting in for Adit Naidu, and you're watching The Heat. Simply put, during the first half of this year, the global economy experienced modest growth and a sluggish recovery, with prospects remaining uncertain. The IMF is saying the economy is set for modest growth over the next couple of years amid cooling activity in the United States, a bottoming out in Europe, and stronger consumption and exports for China. Global growth is expected to remain stable at about 3.2% this year. That's a slight tick up from 3.3%. In 2025, but it warns of near-term risks, especially when it comes to inflation. Okay, for more on what all this means, how it affects you out there across the world, let's go straight to our panel. John Gong is a professor at the University of International Business and Economics. Anthony Chan is a former chief economist with J.P. Morgan Chase. Also joining us, Liang, a chair professor in economics at Willamette University, and Otaviano Canuto served as a World Bank vice president and executive director. He's currently a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South. Thank you all. Otaviano, I want to start with you. We kind of laid it out there in a very broad fashion, but break it down for us. This past year plus, people have had to worry about the possibility of a global recession. In the United States and various other places, always concerned about inflation. China's not dealing with inflation, but it has its own concerns. Kind of give me a litmus test, where we are now, what you think the big concerns are, and what is the average homeowner going through?
As always, a pleasure to be here and with such brilliant colleagues. In my view, the news coming out this week from the U.S. were a bit more positive than expected, because ultimately the figures that had been initially reported for the economic growth of the U.S. Have been revised, lending support to those who argue that the U.S. economy is on track for a soft landing. And the output in the U.S. was up 3% from a year earlier, during the 3 months to the end of June. And also the figures on the unemployment side have not been, let's say, dramatic. So I think, despite the fact that we had in the beginning of this month such the panic that we saw after the unwinding of the carry trade from Japan and so on, fact of the matter is that the economy is decelerating, but at least judging by the U.S. and combined with the good news on the inflation front in Germany released today, on the way to a soft landing.
Okay, Anthony, the World Bank is saying that the global economy is expected to stabilize this year for the first time in 3 years. And looking at historical standards, well, what does that mean? They're expecting the economic growth to be about 2.6% this year before edging up to 2.7% next year. What I'm looking for, Anthony, is perspective, because if you look before the pandemic hit, that growth was about 3%. Kind of put that in perspective for us, what it means, and build on what Otaviano talked about, the soft landing for the U.S. There has been some positive information out there.
Well, there has been positive information, and in fact, you would expect that as the business cycle does mature, you could see some normalizing, you could see some stabilization of growth, and usually as an expansion matures, economic growth does slow down. But we didn't see that in the U.S. numbers, as Otaviano pointed out. You actually got an upward revision in GDP today, 3% versus a previous number of 2.8%. But more importantly, consumer spending, which is really the bellwether of how the economy is doing in the U.S., that number was dramatically revised upwards. So that's looking good. And the labor market is still strong. We saw initial unemployment claims coming in at levels that are not consistent with a recession. And that's why a soft landing is more realistic at this point. And in case you're worried, central banks around the world are moving in the direction of lowering rates, whether it be Europe, whether it be the United States. The Federal Reserve has made it all but clear that the next move is going to be a cut. So again, if there's any concerns about the economy falling out of bed, the Federal Reserve is already preemptively ready to move. And in fact, the Atlanta Federal Reserve, which is pretty accurate in telling you where things are going, they're still projecting very solid 2% growth for the third quarter. Remember that potential growth is 1.8%, so much, much stronger.
Okay. Liang, let's zip across the Pacific now and talk about China. As I mentioned, it does have its problem with unemployment and also the housing sector, which is the really big unknown in there, and trying to get consumers in that country to buy more. That is something that the government has challenged consumers with this year. China's economy saw 5% growth in the first half of the year, and according to the IMF, again, it's projected to be the world's economic champion for the next 5 years, continue to drive the engine that kind of fuels the global economy. Talk about how important China is going to be and what its concerns are, and Liang, if you think that China is in position right now to navigate these white waters ahead.
Right, good to talk to you. I think for one, we understand that China is in the process of transition in the sense that it's upgrading its industrial structure. It is fostering the so-called new quality productive forces, and it's also undergoing this energy transition as indicated by the white paper released yesterday. So I think we need to think about all these in terms of the context of the growth, and the growth target was set at around 5% this year. I think it's well still within the range of the reach. I think you're right. We're witnessing China is growing in terms of industrial output has grown by 5.1% in the first 7 months. Industrial profits have gone up by 3.6%, which is very solid and healthy, especially when you look at the high-tech manufacturing and high-tech investment. They both grow by about over 10% so far this year. So I think, all these are really positive signs of the economy is undergoing, this kind of transition and upgrading. But on the other hand, you're right. There are some, I would say, really headwinds. One thing has to do with the property market that is still continue to readjust. The new home price has gone down by 4% year over year in July. And continuously, we see the property sector investment, fell by over 10%. So yes, we need more policy support to stabilize the housing market. But I think the other important area that we do need to see more policy support has to do with the local government debt. So the local government has been really important in supporting local economies and also, providing very essential social services and programs that would allow households to reduce a little bit their precautionary savings and spend more. But right now we're seeing the local governments are only issuing about 45% of their quota for this year's bonds, which is much lower than last year's over 60-some% at this point. So I think that is important. Now, one last thing that I want to say about consumer spending, I think consumers do have the money. This year so far we have seen the households have put another $1.6 trillion worth of deposits in the banks. And their income has been growing by 6.3% disposable income this year so far, which is higher than the GDP. So it's not a matter of no money to spend, but really the confidence needs to be rebuilt. So I think all these areas need to be having more policy support before we can see a more robust recovery and growth.
Okay, John Gong, I think our panelists have really kind of laid out where things stand, and it's relatively solid footing. But I think that Anthony did talk about one thing. We talked about the central banks around the world prepared to cut. And you're always worried, though, about the unseen or things that you can't predict. And we have to talk about the conflicts going on globally. Those are certainly continued drag on the economy as well. Ukraine and Gaza, no end in sight in those areas. Obviously, the supply chain is uprooted, the human suffering, which just goes on and on. It's very difficult for people to plan any kind of life if you're having to move constantly. How do these geopolitical tensions drag down the global economy?
Okay, thank you very much, John, for having me. I would like to start by saying that, I was on the record to say last time on this program that I'm very skeptical about a recession in the United States. And I totally agree with Anthony that, I think if there's any recession at all in the U.S., it could be a soft landing. I'm not so concerned about it. As a matter of fact, I'm more concerned about the economic performance in China. I just want to add one more thing to what Professor Liang has just said. who always did a great job, I guess. That has to do with the local government's debt issue. In a situation like this, the government should take a expansionary policy, fiscal policy and monetary policy, but due to the bloated bureaucracies in local governments and also the debt situation in the local governments, exacerbated by the property market weakness, they're actually doing the exact opposite. I mean, you can understand why the local governments are cutting back on expenditures and try to balance their budget. But I think that has a huge impact on consumer confidence because it impacts a lot of people. Now you're talking about salary reductions for civil employees. You're talking about cutting back on contracting work for the government. And after all, China's government expenditures account for about 40% of the total GDP. Now, if that part is going through a contraction, obviously it's going to have a huge impact on the broader market. And I think that's really the problem. So I strongly advocate that the central government take the leadership to relieve local governments that issue by via, say, for example, issuing more national bonds. Not cutting back on expenditures. As a matter of fact, they should do the exact opposite.
John, I certainly understand where you're going, but I kind of want to focus on the conflicts at this point. We'll have a chance to kind of go back and revisit, but clearly that is something, the unknown, that really has the ability to adversely affect the global economy.
No, yes, absolutely. I was just about to say that. Well, I mean, regarding these two wars, in my view, at least the war in Gaza has some, we're probably getting to the end of the tunnel. We're seeing some light of the tunnel here. No, the Ukraine war certainly is not going to end anytime soon. But I think the rest of the world I mean, this war has been going on for almost 3 years now. By now, I think the world economy is already getting accustomed or adjusting to the situation there. The Russian economy itself is already adjusting to this. So I think even though the war has a devastating effect on people in Ukraine and also on the neighboring countries, but I think overall, we certainly would like to see the war ending, right? But I think in terms of its impact on the world economy, I don't see it's going to end anytime soon. And I think the impact is, from a marginal point of view, it is fairly limited. So I think we're going to got stuck with this war at least for another year, in my view, and that we just have to live up with that.
Okay. Otaviano, let's talk about the emerging markets, because as you look at the developed nations right now, the World Bank thinks that the growth is going to be limited, at least moving forward, despite the recent positive information that is out there. And they're looking for developing nations to kind of pick up the pace, if you will, where the other countries begin to recede. Latin America, Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, picking up the pace. Talk to us about the connection between these two economies with your work at the World Bank, and how you think that maybe they can have some kind of bridge that will continue to forge its way through these uncertain times.
Right. If I may just reference, reinforcing what John said about the impacts of the tensions in the Middle East and in Eastern Europe as well. Let's recall that to some extent, those geopolitical risks have put a floor to the oil price. Say, given the evolution of supply and demand, one would expect those prices to be a little bit lower. But nonetheless, in the case of oil, clearly, I work with a forecast for the Brent oil staying around $85 a barrel the remainder of this year as well as next year. And despite the action by the OPEC members to support prices, at the end of the day, it is the geopolitical configuration that is establishing a limit. Which is a bit different in the case of the other commodities. The agriculture, let's highlight the harvests in Brazil, in Argentina as well, and in the U.S. are bound to establish, let's say, a substantially loose condition in the case of agriculture. And in the metals, we will have to wait to see the results of the U.S. election to see to the extent to which we will move far from or keeping on the energy transition. On emerging markets and developing economies, you know, I myself co-authored a book when I was at the World Bank in 2010, talking about the emerging markets and developing economies, ultimately becoming the other source of growth in the global economy.
Right.
As the advanced economies might face inevitable declines in their growth performance. But at the end of the day, what the history has shown since then, since 2010, is that the performance has been very different among emerging markets and developing economies. On the one hand, and this year has been exactly like this. You look at Latin America, surprisingly, the economic growth of Brazil has outpaced the expectations, the forecast by multilateral institutions, by banks and so on, whereas the performance of the Mexican economy has been, let's say, lower than in previous years. Because of the domestic factors, because of policies, right, because of politics, and so on. And we still have, of course, a substantial number of low-income countries having to face unsustainable debt conditions.
Okay, Anthony, I want to pick up on something Liang talked about earlier, the amount of money that residents of China are socking into their savings account, because the most recent information we have here in the U.S., it shows that consumer spending continues. So it seems that U.S. spenders will spend money when they have it and even when they don't. So talk about that, this latest information out there, and your assessment of the U.S. economy, and also the way a rate cut is going to figure in to consumer confidence. It always means something, whether it really has substantial initial impact, but just the fact that rates come down kind of allows everyone to take a deep breath.
Well, Sean, what's going on, I think, in China, and that's certainly something that they're trying very hard to change, is to strengthen the safety net. There's a lot of talk out in China that if you strengthen the safety net, then consumers in China will have the confidence to spend more because they do have the money. And in fact, you can also show some signs that the central government is trying to stimulate the economy in China. And in fact, the situation is already turning a little bit in that direction. The Central Bank of China, or the PBOC, is already stress testing the banks in China to see what happens to the banks if there is a surge in the number of bonds that are issued. Now, why would there be a surge in the number of bonds issued? Obviously, because of stimulus. So that certainly is at least something that they're considering. Here in the United States, everybody says, well, what would it matter if somehow you lower interest rates by a 1/4 percentage point? It will matter because already you started to see mortgage rates coming down without the Federal Reserve even lowering rates. Right. So to the extent that the Federal Reserve not only lowers rates, but gives the expectation that they're going to continue to lower rates by as much as 75 to 100 basis points this year, you'll continue to see those rates go down. And guess what happens? You see that the interest-sensitive sectors sort of get a boost, and I'm talking about autos, I'm talking about housing, and that certainly is going to give a little bit of a boost to the overall U.S. economy. And let's not lose sight of the fact, Sean, that everybody says that the reason why consumers are so depressed with regard to consumer confidence, and by the way, the latest numbers actually was an uptick, not a downtick, is because of inflation. And every indication is that we see is that inflation is going down. So if inflation is going down and policy rates are going down, that certainly is a formula for continued economic growth in the U.S.
Anthony, I want you to put a toe in this minefield that is the U.S. Presidential race as well. If indeed we get 50% basis cut in the month of September, the economy continues to pick up. To what degree do you think that's going to help Kamala Harris and the Democrats as they continue their push trying to hold the White House?
Well, I think it helps a little bit with respect to sentiment, but not in terms of the economy. Certainly, everybody knows that monetary policy has long and variable lags, so you're not going to see the impact of a cut in rates dramatically having a serious impact on the economy in 70 or 80 days. Now, I do realize that because of the way the economy, social media, and a lot of the transmission mechanism is much faster now than it was when Milton Friedman talked about long and variable lags.
Right.
But it's not a situation where you lower interest rates and tomorrow morning the economy gets a boost. It still takes a little time.
Right.
We need to see what credit market conditions do and things like that. It takes a little time. So you'll see some impact, but not a total impact from the cutting rates.
Okay, Liang, we want to take you into this minefield of U.S. Elections as well. Kamala Harris and Donald Trump outlining their policies and both kind of blaming outside forces for U.S. lost jobs, closed foreign markets, an overvalued dollar. Trump's remedy, more of what he had in the past, more tariffs, including a 10% tariff on all U.S. imports. Tell me what you think the consequences of this let's tariff various nations, especially China.
Right. So I think you can see that there are a lot of contradictions when it comes to policies of the Biden administration. So on the one hand, they're talking about, we need to fight inflation, but they're not really willing to take on those big corporations that are, the ones that are hiking the prices. And I think for consumers, yes, the inflation is coming down. We have disinflation, but it never means that the price has gone down, right? The price is just going up at a slower pace. And I heard that, you talked about how the rate cuts could help consumers. Definitely. We have seen, the consumers where for the ones that have, delayed payments on their credit cards has jumped up to 13.3%. And that is the highest since April 2021. So definitely, I think households are struggling. The real wage has gone up by only 1.1% this year. That is not a pretty picture for the average households. And I think, ironically, when we put so much emphasis on interest rates and hoping that when we raise it, it will fight inflation. When we lower it, it will steer the economy. I think one interesting fact here is that with a high interest rate, the federal government is paying close to about $1 trillion this year projected as interest payment to the private sector, of course, to the people who have the money and hold those treasuries. And so with the rate cuts, that's going to reduce the kinds of stimulus, income transferred from the federal government to the private sector. Of course, this is very regressive transfer, but still, I think, interest rate has very complicated impacts on the economy. And I also really want to echo what, Anthony was saying, the monetary policy has a lot of legs, and which is, I think, is a very interesting big topic this year at the Jackson Hole's meeting, that they talked about, how we can accelerate, the transmission mechanisms from monetary policy to the broad economy. So I think that's very interesting. But going back to the point, I think there's a lot of good ideas by the Biden administration, for example, implement these industrial policies and manufacturing jobs. But I think the data suggests the opposite, right? We just had 818,000 jobs revision, and the manufacturing sector is the one that has seen 96,000 job losses as opposed to 19,000 jobs added to the economy. So again, I think there are a lot of good intentions for the Biden administration to implement some policy to help the economy. But unfortunately, I don't think the result has been as optimistic as they would like us to believe.
John, from a global standpoint, you look at the U.S. economy, it's holding its own. Not so much in the EU. Obviously, Europe is struggling to keep up as well. And China's policies, they are really aimed at trying to get citizens to go out and buy these big ticket items, buy a new EV, buy new appliances for your home. Talk to us about this industrial transformation that we see in China right now, going to higher tech, better quality, and also what is holding Europe back in your thoughts?
Well, I still like to comment on your U.S. presidential election first. Well, I think the issues, the economics we've been discussing here have very little bearing on the election, I think. First of all, election is going to start in the next 2 or 3 weeks, actually. I mean, the earliest mail-in ballot time in the state of North Carolina is going to be sometime in September. I think it's mid-September. So it's going to happen very soon. The second thing is that I think, what the Harris strategy is all about putting together a rainbow coalition. I mean, we're really talking about the African Americans, the Latinos, the LGBTQ communities, the young college students, these people. And what they're concerned about is not so much about inflation as we, economists think about it. Right now, there's very little inflation right now. But the prices are very high compared to 2019, I guess, right? I think these are the issues that, these minority communities are very much concerned about. But anyway, I think, in this election, it's not so much about substance, in my view. It's more about Trump or no Trump, freedom or no freedom, right? I mean, these are the issues that the Harris campaign is really focusing on. And I think, given the post I've been reading, she has a pretty good chance, actually. I think, she probably has a very good chance in Pennsylvania. She probably has some good chance in Georgia, which is the first state she visited after the DNC. So I think overall, it's going to be a very close race, but I will put my money on the Harris campaign. Now, regarding your question about China, what I think is happening in China is that we are seeing essentially a double, it's a forked pattern here. On one side, we are seeing, these high-tech industries doing great, right? I mean, the electric car industry, the battery industries, these export powerhouse industries are performing quite well. On the other hand, I see, a lot of traditional industries not doing so well, and especially there are a lot of jobs involved in these industries, and I attribute this a lot to the cutting back of the government expenditures. And sort of a contractual fiscal policy at some local governments. That's probably accounting for a lot of the slowdown growth in China right now.
Okay.
Finally, about Europe, I think Europe is just going to tug along. I think finally we're starting to see some signs of recovery in Germany, but with this war going on, and especially against the context that the Russians are still marching in Donbass, I think the picture in Europe is just going to be there, not going to improve in a significant way.
Okay, Anthony, we only have about a minute, but I'd like to get you to follow up on this whole price gouging. If you look at grocery prices, they've gone up 21%. Overall, prices gone up 19%. You understand why U.S. consumers are fed up.
Yeah, I understand that when you see those prices, we all go into the supermarket. But I actually wrote an article on Substack.com under the People's Economist, and I found that if you go back to 2019, yes, those are the numbers, that prices for food and certainly overall the consumer price index has gone up by the numbers you've mentioned. But average hourly earnings have actually gone up by more than this increase. Now, it's a tiny amount over it, but it's higher. So, yes, we're complaining that prices don't go back to 2019, but I don't hear anybody complaining that they want wages to go back to what they were in 2019. And when you look at both of them, you do see that wages are slightly higher. Okay,
Anthony, good stuff. And I don't think you're going to get anybody complaining about wages going up, at least not right now. I want to thank our panel for everything. I enjoyed our discussion. And that is it for this edition of The Heat, everyone. I'm glad you watched. I'm Sean Calebs in Washington, D.C.